Hello everybody, this is Dr. Novak again. As you see in the very beginning, Aqua Bias Plus made from JBL seems to be a good choice for those of you who are over in Europe and other countries and can't seem to get laterite or have a good substrate for your aquarium. That seems to work the best. Okay, what we have is a little Q&A, but what pictures you're going to be looking at are ones that were just sent to me yesterday from a hobbyist that is spawning Wild Discus, and they are spawning every few weeks. It seems like they get scared and the eggs are not exactly hatching, or they're eating the eggs because they seem to become spooked by the other fish that are in the aquarium. They really need to have an aquarium by themselves. But anyway, they seem to be spawning every few weeks. And this is one of the people, of course, that have watched my YouTube channel and has implemented an Anoxic filter with a Plenum in his aquarium. And this happens to be one of his tanks, 75-gallon, that he's using, and the fish are continually spawning like this, which I'm sure a lot of people would like to have their Wild Discus spawn like this continuously. Anyway, this video is a question that was asked to me, and we're going to get right into that question and the answer to the question without trying to get too scientific on everything, okay? Okay, let's get into it. It says, hi, I've had a planted tanks for years now. My 75-gallon is fitted with Kessel lighting, pressurized CO2, and dosing with dry fertilizers. For years, plants kept growing like crazy, and I was sick of trimming them. Then suddenly, they stopped growing completely and started getting covered with diatom algae. Most fast-growing plants died off, and I was left with a moderate/slow-growing plants. There was no change in terms of tank maintenance and conditions. This is a very common question, by the way. This is not an uncommon question. Now I've started again with new plants, CO2 dosing, but my plants are not pearling again. I used to read forums where people complained about their plants not growing and used to wonder how that was even possible. CO2 plants need light. CO2 and fertilization, but strange then, despite my providing all three, it is not working. So he's providing light, he's providing CO2 and fertilization, but it's not working. And this is the second time he's made his aquarium. I've even tried switching from dry ferts to Flourish line of products, but that didn't work. Could my Kessel tuna sunlight be an issue? I'll tell you right now, it's not likely the issue. I used them when my plants were growing like crazy, and the lighting is still pretty new and bright. Any suggestion, recommendations would be much appreciated. I'd love for my plants to start growing pearling like they used to. Thanks in advance. Okay, what is being asked is just one example of what happens when plants need a resting period and our substrate is exhausted of all nutrients to accommodate your plant's needs. Nevertheless, if you listen to the question, which I just have read to you carefully, you may find there's a lot of information missing, like parameters of the CO2, pH, nitrates, does the substrate sit directly on the bottom of the tank, substrate oxygen levels, redox, TDS, etc., etc. So there's a lot of questions that could be asked, okay? It can't be answered. The question to this question could go on, and most hobbyists will think it's time to start anew with newer and better substrate, some costing hundreds of dollars. However, don't throw that old substrate away because it's time to rejuvenate it with iron once again. Like I have explained in my other videos, I've actually grown plants in just gravel, small size gravel, by just adding laterite. That's it. Gravel's 25 years old. So let's see. In most cases, it's not the substrate, but it's how the tank was initially set up in the first place. Very fine substrates, example, sand and or dirt, will cause the most problems in the long run because they will compact even more so than other mediums will. Or should I say, they will show the first signs of trouble in the least amount of time given. This has already been scientifically proven, but some hobbyists refuse to heed the science disciplines and insist on using these mediums as a cheap alternative substrate in closed systems. Water movement through the substrate will change, and so will the electrical properties as far as millivolt readings go. Hobbyists do not own the right test equipment to test such changes in the substrate, so these insults, chemical and biological changes go unabated for months or even years. If back in the late 70s using these substrates failed, then why would they work any differently today using the same methods? You know, I don't know, hobbyists, they're using sands and dirt and stuff. This is nothing new. Okay, try to understand that. This is nothing new. It's already been tried back in the 70s. It's in books, magazines, and everything else. So if it really didn't work then, why do you think it's going to work now? What's different? The glass is different? Your attitude's different? You understand what I mean? It's the same thing. One way of rejuvenating your substrate, of course, as we all know, is with laterite, which is an iron source of weathered clay. In other countries, they may have their own form of a laterite, and this is something that you can add to it. It does require some rethinking on the hobbyist part on how and why your substrate becomes exhausted and did not replenish itself from the water column with new nutrients and ions, okay? And this is something that everybody who places their substrate on the bottom seems to forget. How does your substrate get replenished automatically in an enclosed system like our aquariums or our ponds? As we all know, farmers rotate their crops as not to exhaust the ground of all of its nutrients, and sometimes even plant nutrient-giving plants in their fields, like alfalfa, for example, so far as not to exhaust any available nutrient supply that is left in the soil. Well, the same thing happens in our aquatic planted tanks. But hobbyists think just because they add fertilizers to the substrate that will do the trick. Moreover, because the substrate has not been lifted off the bottom of the aquarium, using like a plenum for example, the chemical and biological pathways that were once open to chemical and biological mediators has now stopped or slowed down to the point that available ions are not moving in and out of the substrate as freely as when first set up. Now the substrate has become an algae-friendly source of food, and higher order plants hobbyists use are exposed to these inhibitors from anaerobic zones from the substrate that impede the plant's ability to photosynthesize. Algae, on the other hand, uses lower amounts of these nutrients and is a lover of nitrates, ammonia ions, and phosphates, and the soil substrate then becomes too acidic than they became the dominating factor in the ecosystem, along with unwanted cyanobacteria that plagues ponds and aquariums alike. Until the substrate becomes open to chemical and biological mediators and once again to oxygen, it will stay as a death pool or a plant inhibitor. Something that hobbyists don't understand is their substrates can become acidic. Plants cannot grow in very acidic soils. They don't know that when you place your substrate directly on the bottom. As we all know, farmers and even golf courses, as with their turf, will aerate the ground by either turning it over or by aerating tools that will punch holes or core the turf to keep it open to aid beneficial bacteria. Aerating or aeration is nothing new to gardeners and farmers, but it seems to be something that hobbyists have overlooked by placing the substrate directly on the bottom of their tanks and not allowing oxygen to penetrate unabated into the substrate. The word unabated is the word we're looking for. It means unobstructed. Time then becomes their enemy, and it seems like time always wins the battle of oxygen degradation in the substrate. Hobbyists depend on the diffusion of ions will always be open to mediators, but this has been proven it's just not so. So placing your substrate directly on the bottom, we think one thing, but it really is not going to happen. Okay? When I experiment with different substrates with the Anoxic filtration system, permeability and pore water capabilities with different substrates change with time because of the unforeseen insult that change the electrical properties of the substrate. Over time, permeability and pore water management will change, and in most cases will change for the worse than for the better. The biggest biological filter of a planted tank is the substrate, yet most hobbies fail to realize their mistake until the precipice of algae and cyanobacteria take over and dominate the higher order plants they are trying to grow. Affirmative action now must be taken, and soon. It will not matter how much light, fertilizers, or CO2 is added to the system because chemical and biological mediators are not working properly any longer. To rectify this problem is easy, and it does not require hobbies to buy new or better substrates. Okay? It is now time to do it right and forget about what you thought was right way, and this time do it right once and for all. The substrate has to be lifted off the bottom of the tank glass using a plenum. Okay, that's explained in my other videos. And the substrate on top of the plenum, okay? If you don't know how to do it, watch some of my older videos and it will explain to you about how to add the substrate with iron, and you can add then you can add a growing substrate on top of that, like a fluval substrate on top of that particular substrate. So you're going to be making kind of like layers of substrate, which will really help in root hair development with that high iron. That's what you want, and you want to lock that iron in there. Make sure when you plant your tank that you do not disturb the iron layer, as you know, if you have using laterite, it may turn your tank a little cloudy. Let's see, you have now added iron back into the substrate to benefit not only the plants but also the bacteria that in their initial inceptive cell development need the iron ion to speed up growth. Now the diffusion of ions through the substrate will be unimpeded, and oxygen ions through electrical charge will stay open to biological and chemical mediators for years to come. I've had tanks set up like this for over 10 years without ever having to completely tear down the system, and nitrates were as low as 5 parts per million or less. Oxygen levels were between 1 part per million to 0.5 parts per million in the substrate. Low but still good enough to keep heterotrophic facultative bacteria alive and working, and leaving the ammonia ion for the plants to assimilate. I have biocenosis clarification baskets set up in a similar theoretical way in an anoxic filter, stay open to chemical and biological mediators for over 35 years now without clogging and changing the pore water and permeability structure of the baskets themselves. That's a long time for something to be set up and not have to be torn apart. Plants look for the ammonia ion first before they will use nitrogen ion because it is a food source that requires less chemical work and energy for their amino acid and proteins. Hydrogen sulfide and methane are not part of the equation that plants as a food source need, but this is exactly what hobbyists are producing when they add a substrate directly to the bottom of an aquarium. If you could look underneath a fish tank when the substrate directly sits on the bottom, you will see in just a few months the blackening of the substrate. Here is a true example. I'm going to give you an example on how important oxygen is to plant roots. Martha Stewart opened her house and garden for people to visit from time to time, like a garden walk or something. After showing her garden off to onlookers, a few days later her lawn began to die off. Her gardener was perplexed over the very strange outcoming and thought it was some kind of lawn disease that was killing off the grass. However, what they found out was prior to the showing of her garden, it had rained and made the ground soft. Okay? But people walking on the lawn, they compacted the earth to the point that oxygen depredation was taking place and the grass started dying off. It was not because of disease as they had thought in the very beginning, but because the roots and the grass no longer received oxygen nutrients as they did preceding to the showing. This is very true of our aquariums. You have to keep that low amount of oxygen coming in there. The same thing happens in our aquariums, of course. The substrate becomes more compact as time goes on just through gravity. If the substrate was on a low side of oxygen requirement by placing the substrate directly on the bottom of the aquarium in the first place, then it will not take much more to cut off the oxygen altogether and cause oxygen depredation in the substrate. The exchange of ions will be hindering the chemoallotrophics and chemoallotrophic to fix their carbon needs. And this fixing of their carbon needs, once the substrate gets lower and lower and then starts cutting off the oxygen, okay, your plants will not grow anymore. They'll stop growing no matter what you try to do. This is all with nitrates in the aquarium is also applied. This whole thing applies to aquariums and, of course, ponds. Think very hard about placing fertilizer tabs that are nothing but nitrates into your substrate. So I often said that do not add fertilizer tabs into your substrate at all. In fact, anything that can saturate the substrate full of nitrates and phosphates, be apprehensive about using. So really have a lot of caution about that. Let's see. And there's another thing. Remember that plants will only start pearling during photosynthesis only when oxygen levels in the tank are at saturation point for a given temperature. The colder the water is, the easier it is for the plants to start pearling at a given temperature, and the easier it is for the water to reach oxygen saturation points. The warmer the water, the harder it is for oxygen to reach saturation point of a given temperature. As the aquarium substrate begins to age and chemical and biological pathways become impeded, oxygen saturation levels cannot be reached as easy as when the aquarium was newly set up, as I have already explained. Let's see. So what I basically have just told you, there's also something here that you may be interested in. Nitrates will affect your TDS readings. The other damaging effect of nitrates were explained 20 years ago by Zaki, MD, PhD, professor of bacteriology, logistics, writing on behalf of the ZNA Research Division, shared his observation of the effect of nitrates on the white ground of Kohaku. He urges that the maximum concentration of nitrates be 15 parts per million. That's the maximum. Stating anything more than this and the skin gradually becomes to deteriorate, improving again as the concentration lessens. He recommends that if nitrates can be kept at 5 parts per million or less, the skin becomes so white it virtually shines. He describes the negative effect of nitrates on, one, reducing the ability to discharge metabolic toxins from the body, resulting in buildup of metabolic waste in the skin, and two, on the pond water becomes less receptive to dissolve of atmospheric oxygen into the water. Okay, you understand, just nitrates can affect the ability of your water to take in oxygen. Something probably never even heard of. He expresses the view that nitrate levels above 10 parts per million adversely affect oxygen dissolved in the water column, such as that saturation levels at a given temperature cannot be reached and maintained. Several scientists have studied mineral levels in different bodies of water and have found that the levels of phosphate and nitrates heavily impact the overall health of the water and its inhabitants. Now, this is right from Azaki. He's a professor, and this is what he wrote about nitrates and phosphates. And the same thing applies to our aquariums, which people say nitrates don't bother anything. Well, here they say nitrates do, and inhibits oxygen. So, something to think about. All I can do is just tell you the research that has been done and what things do compared to what people are saying on the internet. And this is one thing that I think all hobbyists need to understand, is that what's being told to you on the internet that, oh, I have nitrates at high levels and I have this and that and everything's just absolutely fine. Well, is it? Because the research shows very different, really. Okay, that is what the research shows, but if you don't want to believe in the research, that's okay, you don't have to. No one's forcing you to believe it in the first place. Hello everybody, and I wanted to end this video with one more thing. I just got a notice and watched a video from pecktec, and I'm sure a lot of people that watch my YouTube channel watch his YouTube channel. He talks about an update on his 43-gallon 4-month update of his aquarium. And of course, this was the aquarium he used, the Plenum and the Anoxic filter. And he likes it so much, he stated in his video that he's going to do all of his tanks with it. He said he had a little bit of algae problem, nothing to worry about. If you look at his aquarium, like this is a picture of my latest picture of my aquarium, this one that you're looking at, and that's going on what, 6 months old plus, and his is 4 months. But he talks about he likes it so much that he will now implement the Plenum into all his aquariums. because he seems to be having a lot less problems. Just like this video is about. It's about rethinking the way you're being told to do things. And if you just think about it real hard, even if you're a doubting Thomas, as they say, um, you'll understand the science more and more. And that's what I'm just trying to do, get you to understand the science behind everything and why it does work and how come people are so successful. As you saw the person with the discus, he does the same thing. So go over to his channel, take a look-see of his, it's called pecktec, and I'll try to leave a link below in case you want to click on it and watch it. So thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Dr. Novak.